Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and in this lecture, we are going to do a review of verbs of motion. So there's no real new information here. We're just bringing together everything that you've learned in the past few chapters about verbs of motion into one overview of what you know about verbs of motion so far. On slide 2, there is a chart of the verbs of motion that you've learned so far with their conjugations. And I'm not going to go through it in detail here, but just to point out that it is divided into motion on foot or self-propelled motion, and then motion by vehicle. And then we have 3 different types of verbs. We have the imperfective unidirectional verbs, idti and ехать, the imperfective multidirectional verbs, ходить and ездить, and then the perfective verbs, пойти and поехать, that indicate the inception of the motion, so setting off for somewhere. And these 6 verbs, идти, ехать, ходить, ездить, пойти, and поехать, are the 6 verbs of motion that you have learned so far. Let's talk a little bit about the verb идти. And remember that we're going to use the foot verbs, идти and ходить, to indicate travel around campus or travel within the city limits, unless a vehicle is specifically mentioned. So if you don't mention a vehicle and you're talking about traveling around campus or going around town, you are going to want to use идти or ходить. And you're specifically going to want to use the non-past form of идти, so иду, идешь, идут, to indicate motion currently in progress or repeated one-way trips. For example, if you have a certain time. For instance, я сейчас иду в библиотеку. I'm going to the library right now. We have motion currently in progress. Or каждый день в 9 часов я иду на занятия. Every day at 9 o'clock I go to my classes. And probably you make a round trip back to your dorm overall, but at 9 o'clock you are taking a one-way journey, so you're going to use this unidirectional verb of motion, я иду. Now let's talk about ходить. We're going to want to use ходить in the non-past, so хожу, ходишь, ходит, and notice the stress shift, to indicate repeated round trips. For example, я часто хожу в библиотеку. I often go to the library. Каждый день я хожу в библиотеку. Every day I go to the library. And here we're describing the entire round trip, so we use ходить. And then in the past tense, we're going to use ходить, so ходил, ходила, ходили in the past, to indicate both multiple round trips and a single round trip. Anytime you have any kind of a round trip, you're going to want to use ходить. For example, в прошлом году я часто ходил на концерты. Last year, I often went to concerts. There are many round trips here. Вчера я ходила на концерт. Yesterday, I went to a concert. Just one round trip. But in both cases, because we have a round trip, we're going to use ходить. A lot of the same basic rules apply for the vehicular motion verbs, except that you're going to use the vehicular motion verbs ехать, ездить when a vehicle is specifically mentioned or when describing motion between cities, states, or countries, because probably you're going to use a vehicle to get to a different city, state, or country. And for ехать specifically, we're going to use the non-past form of ехать, so еду, едешь, едут, and note the consonant mutation. Just like идти, to indicate motion currently in progress or repeated one-way trips. For example, родители сейчас едут в Москву. My parents are driving to Moscow right now. Я всегда еду на работу на автобусе. I иду домой пешком. I always ride the bus to work, but walk home on foot. And so notice here that we have repeated action, always, but each leg of the overall one-way trip is described with a unidirectional verb of motion because we have 2 different types of motion. We have vehicular motion for the leg of the trip that goes to work, and foot motion for the leg of the trip that comes home. So we use the 2 unidirectional verbs of motion to describe those legs of the trip. Я еду на работу на автобусе, а иду домой пешком. Пешком means on foot. With the verb ездить, you're going to want to use that in the non-past. So езжу, ездишь, ездит. And notice the consonant mutation in the я form to indicate repeated round trips. For example, я часто езжу в Россию. I often go to Russia. Я всегда езжу на работу на автобусе. And here we are implying that you take the bus to work and also home from work. That the entire round trip is taken on the bus. And then in the past tense, we're going to use ездить in the past to indicate any kind of a round trip, whether it's one round trip or multiple round trips. For example, в прошлом году я ездил в Россию. Last year I went to Russia, and the implication is that you went there one time, but it was a round trip, so you use ездить. Or в детстве мы часто ездили в Россию. In childhood, when I was a child, we frequently went to Russia, multiple round trips. But in both cases, you have a round trip, so we have to use ездить. And finally, let's talk about the perfective forms пойти, поехать. And notice that we have formed them by just adding the prefix по to the unidirectional forms идти and ехать. And this is how you make perfective verbs of motion in Russian. You add a prefix to the unidirectional forms. And we're going to use these forms пойти, поехать when we want to indicate motion in the future, when we want to say we want to go somewhere or we invite someone to go somewhere, or if we were describing a one-way trip in the past. So, for example, motion in the future, после урока русского я пойду в библиотеку. After Russian lesson, after Russian class, I will go to the library. We have a single trip that we are planning to complete in the future, so we use this perfective form пойду. После урока русского я пойду в библиотеку. Also, for your purposes, you're going to want to use пойти and поехать when you're extending invitations or expressing a wish. So with the verb хотеть. For example, ты хочешь пойти со мной в столовую? Would you like to go with me to the cafeteria? If you have the verb хотеть, to want, you're probably going to want to use пойти or поехать after it, because you're probably going to say that you want to make this completed trip. You're not just saying, do you want to walk part of the way to the cafeteria? You're actually indicating, do you want to go all the way to the cafeteria? So we use perfective. And then we're going to use these perfective forms in the past tense to indicate a one-way trip in the past. For example, где Маша? Она пошла в библиотеку. Where's Masha? She went to the library. And the implication is she's gone there and she hasn't come back. We have a completed one-way trip, so we're going to use this perfective form, пойти or поехать, and so here we have она пошла в библиотеку. And that is your overview of what you've learned so far about verbs of motion. This is an extremely complex topic, so don't worry if it still seems a little overwhelming. Again, just focus on learning these guidelines, and if you follow these guidelines most of the time, you will use verbs of motion correctly.